Now, first of all, we're going to be hearing from Norman Finkelstein. Norman Finkelstein in 2021 was named as the 5th most influential political scientist in the world, and yet he can't get a permanent academic post. He was a student of Noam Chomsky. He's the child of Holocaust survivors, yet he's been vilified as a Holocaust denier. He describes himself as an old-fashioned communist, and in his controversial and insightful book, The Holocaust Industry, which I recommend people to read, by the way, he claims that the Nazi Holocaust enabled Israel, and this is in quotes, one of the world's most formidable military powers with a horrendous human rights record, to cast itself a state victim. Norman Finkelstein.
When I was growing up, the Holocaust, the Nazi Holocaust, it literally did not exist in American consciousness. I did come from a family where both my parents were survivors. My father was in Auschwitz. My mother was in Majdanek. Every single family member of both sides was exterminated during the war. It was a great shame to be the son of Holocaust survivors back then, because the assumption was if you survived the Nazi Holocaust, you must have done something dirty. Or the assumption was that we went like sheep to the ovens. That was the other side of the shame. Jews were, at that point in time, in the 1950s and 60s, they were just then beginning to make it in American society. And so Jews were not looking back at how we suffered. No. Jews were looking forward. We're going to conquer American society because we are the best. Up until the mid-60s, there were only 2 scholarly studies on the Nazi Holocaust in the English language. 2. The estimate now is there are about 10,000. After World War II, the United States' main ally in Europe was West Germany. The German government consisted, aside from Adenauer at the top, it consisted mostly of former Nazi bureaucrats. If you brought up the Holocaust, you were seen as serving communist Soviet ends, because it was the communists and the Soviet Union who kept hammering away at these were the people who exterminated the Jews. That's America's ally. Jews who were now wanting to make it in the United States, the last thing they wanted to be seen as was aiding and abetting Soviet communist propaganda against the new German government. It was the McCarthy era. The obvious question then is, what changed? How did this Holocaust industry come into play? The answer is, oddly enough, Israel. From Israel's founding in 1947 until 1967, Israel didn't figure at all in American Jewish life, except as an object of charity. Occasionally you'd give money to grow a tree in Israel, but that was really about it. And I think the key turning point is the June 1967 war. Israel inflicts a major historical defeat on one of the U.S.'s major antagonists or adversaries on the world scene. The Middle East contains the most precious resource in the for the industrialized world, namely the oil. And the U.S. was controlling the region except for, after World War II, the phenomenon of what came to be called radical Arab nationalism that had seized the distorted imagination of the Arab people, that the resources beneath their feet belonged to them. And the person who embodied the phenomenon, Gamal Abdel Nasser of Egypt. As it came to pass, it wasn't the US or the British or the French that knocked off Nasser, it was the Israelis. Israel had done the deed. It had achieved a very significant victory. It had terminated the threat posed for more than a decade, from 1952 to 67, a 15-year threat posed by radical Arab nationalism. After 67, it was over. Israel became the US's strategic ally in the Middle East. Israel achieved what appeared to be a huge military victory, but it also now entered into an occupation. Israel acquired the West Bank, Gaza, East Jerusalem, the Golan Heights, and the Sinai Peninsula. All those territories were conquered during the 67 war. And the international community was not prepared to sanction the occupation. Israel was facing a problem. It was alienating the international community. And it then started to invoke the Nazi Holocaust. In particular, one claim, which became the kind of mantra of the Nazi Holocaust. The mantra was that the Nazi Holocaust was unique. And the uniqueness doctrine basically said that never before in the history of humanity has a crime been committed of the magnitude and of the quality of the Nazi Holocaust. If nobody in the history of humanity suffered the way Jews suffered, then ordinary standards of right and wrong shouldn't be applied to them. So whenever Israel was, and it was quite frequently given to the point of every minute of every day, to committing another atrocity, to committing another gross violation of international law, to committing another crime, war crime or crime against humanity, the standard refrain became, well, remember the Holocaust. And so the Nazi Holocaust became a kind of, not a kind of, it became an ideological weapon to delegitimize criticism of Israel, but it's all, at the end of the day, motivated by anti-Semitism. It then became a very convenient excuse for Israeli conduct, namely, it's not that we're doing anything wrong, it's that they claim we're doing things wrong because they hate Jews.